I want to start this in a way that still surprises me when I think about it now, because nothing dramatic happened at first. No shouting, no slammed doors, no tears in front of anyone, just a quiet moment that changed everything. Have you ever had someone hurt you so calmly that it took hours for the pain to even reach your chest? That's how it began for me, sighed a simple phone call, a voice I knew better than my own heartbeat, sounding distant, careful, almost rehearsed, and before I even understood what was happening, Christmas, the one day I held onto all year, was gently taken away from me as if it never belonged to me in the first place. I didn't argue, I didn't ask questions, I didn't defend myself, ha ha ha. Funny how shock can make you polite, isn't it? I just stood there in my kitchen, staring at the counter where I had already written down what time the turkey needed to go into the oven, what spices I would use, what dessert I'd make like I always did, and I nodded as if someone had just told me the weather instead of telling me I wasn't welcome anymore. The silence after that call was loud, heavier than any shouting match could have been, and for a long time I simply stood there, phone still in my hand, wondering when exactly I had become so easy to leave out. I remember whispering to myself, "It's okay, it's fine," even though my chest felt tight and my throat burned, because deep down I already knew something was very wrong, I just wasn't ready to name it yet. You see, I had spent years telling myself that love means understanding, that being a good mother means stepping back, not interfering, not complaining, especially when your child grows up and builds a life of their own. But no one ever tells you how thin that line is between giving space and slowly erasing yourself. I walked around my house that evening, touching small things without realizing it: the back of a chair, the edge of the table, the picture frame with my son smiling as a teenager, and each step felt heavier, like the house itself was asking me what I planned to do now. I tried to distract myself, made tea I didn't drink, turned on the television I didn't watch, laughed softly at a joke I didn't hear. Ha ha ha, that kind of laugh you give just to prove you're still okay, even when you're not. The truth is, I had been holding my breath for a long time, long before that call, and I didn't even know it. I had learned to accept little disappointments, tiny cuts, moments of being overlooked, telling myself they didn't matter, that I was being mature, understanding, patient. But patience can quietly turn into permission if you're not careful. As the evening grew darker, something strange happened inside me. Not anger, not yet, more like clarity slipping in through the cracks, calm and uncomfortable, like when you finally admit a room has been messy for years and you can't ignore it anymore. I sat down at my small kitchen table, the same one where I used to help with homework and pack lunches, and I let myself feel everything I had been pushing down: sadness, confusion, that hollow feeling of being needed only when it's convenient. And I realized how tired I was, not just physically, but tired of explaining my worth through what I gave. That's when it hit me. Nothing about that phone call was sudden. It was simply the moment everything hidden finally spoke out loud. I thought about how easily the words had come to him, how practiced they sounded, how quickly he had chosen comfort over conversation, and I wondered how long this decision had been sitting there, growing quietly while I was still planning meals and wrapping gifts. I told myself I would sleep on it, that things would look different in the morning, but deep down I knew sleep wouldn't change what had already been revealed. Late that night, when the house was completely still and the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall, I opened my laptop, not with anger, not with tears streaming down my face, but with a strange sense of calm that honestly scared me more than rage ever could. My hands trembled just a little as I stared at the screen, and for a moment I paused, thinking, am I really about to do this? Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it, and once you stop pretending, there's no going back to who you were before. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs and makes your shoulders drop, and I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about what would keep everyone else comfortable. I was thinking about survival, about dignity, about the quiet respect I had slowly lost along the way. That night wasn't loud or dramatic, no tears falling onto the keyboard, no angry words typed out, just a simple action taken in silence, the kind of action that doesn't feel powerful at first but carries weight you don't understand until later. And as I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, walking toward my bedroom with slow, careful steps, one thought echoed in my mind again and again, keeping me awake long after I lay down. If love disappears the moment you stop giving, was it ever really love at all? I didn't know it yet, but the choice I made that night was about to pull the truth into the open in ways I never imagined. And by the next morning, someone would be standing at my door, forcing me to face exactly what my silence had been protecting all along. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something that stayed heavy in my chest for years. Have you ever looked back at your life and realized you gave so much of yourself that you forgot who you were without giving? That thought followed me the morning after that quiet night, when the sun came in through my curtains like it always did, warm and gentle, completely unaware that something inside me had shifted. I made coffee out of habit, even smiled at myself in the mirror, ha ha ha, that tired smile you wear like armor, and I started remembering how all of this began long before Christmas, long before that phone call, long before I learned how easily I could be left out. For 32 years, I lived as a widow, and saying that word still feels strange sometimes. Sigh, because I never chose that life. It chose me when my husband passed away and left me with a teenage son and a future I had to rebuild from scratch. I didn't remarry not because I couldn't, but because every ounce of love, energy, and focus I had went into raising my son. He became my reason to wake up early, to work late, to keep pushing when my body was tired and my heart felt lonely. I worked double shifts as a nurse, came home with aching feet and swollen hands, and still managed to cook dinner, help with schoolwork, listen to his worries, and pretend I wasn't exhausted, hahaha, because mothers learn how to hide their pain very well. I missed holidays, birthdays, weekends, also he could have opportunities I never did, and I told myself it was worth it every single time I saw him smile. When he went to college, I paid what I could, cut back on everything else, skipped vacations I never took anyway, delayed fixing things in the house, delayed doctor visits too, all because somehow there was always something more important than me. And when he graduated, I felt proud in a way that filled every empty space inside me. I believed that all those sacrifices had shaped him into a kind, responsible man who understood what it meant to give and to appreciate. Maybe that's why I didn't notice how naturally giving had become my role, not just as a mother, but as a solution, a safety net, a quiet backup plan no one talked about out loud. When he introduced me to his wife, I wanted to love her truly, and I convinced myself that the uneasy feeling I sometimes had was just me learning to let go, learning to accept that my son's life now included someone else at the center. I helped with the wedding, smiled through decisions I didn't agree with, nodded through moments where I felt invisible, telling myself, this is what good mothers do, even when my chest felt tight and my voice felt small. After they married, the requests started gently, almost sweetly, and I remember thinking it felt good to still be needed. A little help here, a little support there, nothing that felt wrong on its own. But help has a way of growing quietly when no one sets limits, and before I knew it, giving wasn't something I chose anymore, it was something expected. I paid without asking questions, listened without interrupting, believed promises that always seemed reasonable in the moment, sighed because it was easier to trust than to face the fear of being seen as difficult or unloving. Somewhere along the way, my life began to shrink around their needs, and I didn't notice because I told myself that was what love looked like, that my role was to make things easier for them, even if it made things harder for me. I ate simpler meals, delayed replacing old clothes, ignored small aches and pains. While they talked about plans, trips, and future dreams I was quietly financing without being invited into. I laughed it off when people said I was too generous, hahaha, because generosity sounded better than admitting I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. Looking back now, it's strange how obvious it all feels, but at the time, it was just my normal, my routine, my purpose, and questioning it felt almost wrong, like betraying my own identity. That morning, as I sat alone with my coffee growing cold, memories kept stacking up in my mind, not as sharp regrets, but as soft realizations, each one whispering the same uncomfortable truth. I had been loved most when I was useful. I didn't feel angry yet, just sad, deeply sad, in a quiet way that made my eyes sting without tears falling, because sadness is often what shows up before strength does. I wondered how many times I had chosen silence over honesty, comfort over boundaries, and I felt that familiar urge to excuse it all, to say, they didn't mean it, or they're just stressed. But that excuse was starting to feel heavy, like a coat I'd been wearing in the wrong season for far too long. As the day went on, I found myself thinking less about Christmas and more about patterns, about how this wasn't one moment of exclusion, but a long story of me stepping aside piece by piece, smiling while doing it, believing that love would notice and return on its own. And that thought scared me, because if this wasn't about one holiday, then it meant the decision I made the night before wasn't just a reaction. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something I couldn't undo with an apology or a promise. By evening, I understood one thing clearly, and it settled in my chest like a quiet warning. When you build your entire identity around giving, people forget to ask how you're doing, and once that happens, taking your power back doesn't look kind, it looks shocking. I didn't know how far this would go yet, or how badly it would hurt, but I could feel it coming, like distant thunder you sense before the storm actually arrives. And as I lay down that night, staring at the ceiling, one question wouldn't leave me alone. If I stopped being the one who always saved them, who would they become when they had no one left to lean on? Let me ask you something that still makes me pause when I think about it now. When did helping someone start to feel less like love and more like obligation? And how do you even notice that shift while it's happening? Because for me, it didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as small favors and reasonable requests, the kind you say yes to without thinking, because saying no feels harder than giving. At first, it was simple things, almost sweet. Say, a phone call asking if I could help cover a security deposit just until a paycheck came through. A quick request to loan a little money for a car repair. Nothing that felt dangerous on its own, and I remember laughing softly and saying, of course, because it felt good to still be needed, to still matter in a world where my role had already started shrinking. The promises always sounded sincere, filled with gratitude and reassurance, and I believed them because believing felt kinder than questioning. Ha ha ha. After all, what kind of mother keeps score with her own child? But slowly, those one time favors turned into patterns, and patterns turned into expectations. And before I even realized it, helping wasn't something I offered anymore, it was something assumed. I'd hear phrases like just this month or just until things settle, and I'd nod automatically, even when a quiet voice inside me whispered that things never seemed to settle. I ignored that voice, because I didn't want to be the difficult one, the unsupportive one, the mother who suddenly became inconvenient. Around that time, their lifestyle began to change in small but noticeable ways, and I told myself it wasn't my place to judge. New clothes, nicer dinners, weekends away, all things I convinced myself were normal for young couples building a life. Meanwhile, my own life stayed exactly the same, or maybe even smaller, though I didn't want to admit it. I clipped coupons, postponed replacing worn out shoes, told myself the leaky faucet could wait another month. I smiled when they talked about future plans, nodded when they mentioned expenses, even laughed along when they joked about being broke, ha ha ha, all while quietly covering gaps I wasn't supposed to see. There were moments when I almost spoke up, moments when I nearly asked how long this was going to last, but every time I opened my mouth, fear closed it again. The fear of being seen as selfish, of damaging the fragile closeness I was desperately trying to protect. And so I stayed quiet, convincing myself that love meant endurance, that real support didn't come with conditions, even when that support began to drain me in ways no one noticed. The truth is, once people get used to you fixing things, they stop learning how to fix them themselves, and I had unknowingly become the invisible solution to problems they no longer felt responsible for solving. I remember scrolling through photos one evening, seeing images of them smiling at expensive restaurants, glasses raised, looking carefree, and instead of feeling happy for them, I felt something twist in my chest, a mix of confusion and guilt, because part of me wondered how those moments were being paid for while I was eating soup again to stretch my grocery budget. I hated myself for that thought. I hated that money had entered my emotions at all, but money has a way of revealing truths we try to avoid. Every time I told myself, this is the last time, another request followed, and every time I agreed, the line moved a little further away until I wasn't sure where it had been in the first place. I started noticing how quickly conversations shifted whenever I hinted at limits, how smoothly the subject changed, how easily gratitude faded once help became routine. It wasn't cruel, not openly, but it was careless, and carelessness can hurt just as deeply when it comes from the people you love most. I laughed it off when friends gently warned me, hahaha, saying they didn't understand how families worked, that helping your children never ends, but deep down, I felt the exhaustion building, not just in my body, but in my spirit. I felt myself becoming quieter, less expressive, choosing peace over honesty, because peace seemed easier than conflict, even when that peace came at the cost of my own voice. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, wondering why I felt so empty after giving so much, and whether that emptiness was trying to tell me something important. I asked myself if this was just what motherhood looked like in the end, slowly fading into the background, valued mainly for what you could provide rather than who you were, and that thought made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't know it then, but each yes I gave without question was quietly teaching them what to expect from me, and each time I swallowed my discomfort, I was reinforcing a role I would later struggle to escape. By the time I finally noticed how heavy it had all become, the balance was already gone, replaced by an unspoken rule that I would always step in, always smooth things over, always sacrifice quietly. That realization didn't arrive with anger, but with a slow, sinking sadness, the kind that makes you feel old and tired all at once, even if your heart still wants to believe in the best. And as I sat there one evening, surrounded by a life that felt smaller than it should have been, one uncomfortable truth rose to the surface and refused to be ignored any longer. When help turns into habit and habit turns into expectation, love quietly stops being a choice, and that's when everything begins to fall apart. There's a moment before everything breaks where life gives you a small warning and you either listen to it or you explain it away, and I wish I could tell you I listened, but I didn't. That warning came wrapped in something ordinary, something familiar, something I had done 100 times before without thinking twice, and that's what makes it so painful to remember now. Thanksgiving arrived, and like every year, I told myself this would be different, that maybe things had just been stressful lately, that family dinners had a way of fixing what everyday life quietly damaged. I spent 2 full days in my kitchen preparing my son's favorite dishes, chopping, stirring, tasting, humming softly to myself, ha ha ha, pretending this was just another holiday and not something I was desperately hoping would bring us closer again. I made the stuffing the way he liked it, with extra herbs, roasted the vegetables just right, and baked a pie using a recipe passed down from my late husband's family, the kind of recipe that carries memories in every bite. As I worked, I kept telling myself that effort mattered, that love showed up in these small acts, that once they sat at my table, everything would feel normal again. They arrived late, of course, and I laughed it off, pretending it didn't sting, even as my food sat cooling and my excitement quietly drained away. When they finally walked in, I noticed how little they looked around, how quickly they settled into their phones, their conversations drifting somewhere I wasn't part of, and I told myself not to be sensitive, that I was imagining things, that I needed to relax. Dinner felt different that year, heavier somehow, like every bite came with a pause, every comment felt carefully placed, and when his wife complained about the food being too salty, I smiled and apologized even though I knew I hadn't changed a thing, all because it felt easier to adjust myself than to address the tension sitting right there between us. I watched my son eat quietly, avoiding my eyes, and something in that hurt more than any comment could have, because silence can be louder than criticism when it comes from someone you love. When I brought out the pie, proud despite everything, hoping it might soften the mood, she barely looked at it before saying she was too full and that they needed to leave early for another gathering. Another gathering somewhere else with people who weren't me. I nodded again, of course I did, laughed lightly, ha ha ha, told them to drive safe, while my chest tightened in that familiar way I had learned to ignore. I stood in the doorway watching them leave, their car pulling away down the street, and for a long moment I stayed there, the cold air brushing against my face, feeling like I had just watched something important slip out of reach without fully understanding how it happened. When I went back inside, the house felt too quiet, too still, and the table was still set, plates half full, food I had prepared with love now looking like evidence of effort that hadn't been received. I cleaned up slowly, not because it took that long, but because I didn't want to face the emptiness that came after, the part where you finally admit something feels wrong even if you don't have the words for it yet. As I wrapped leftovers and washed dishes, I replayed the evening in my mind, searching for something I could have done differently, something I could have said, some way I could have made myself easier to include. That's the dangerous part of being someone who gives too much. You start believing exclusion must be your fault. In the days that followed, that dinner stayed with me, lingering in small moments, like when I opened the fridge and saw untouched food, or when I folded tablecloths I had set out with hope. I told myself it was just one holiday, that Christmas would be different, that maybe this was just a phase, but deep down, a quiet voice kept reminding me that patterns don't change unless something forces them to. I noticed how easily they moved on from that dinner, how little it seemed to matter, while I carried it with me like a weight, sigh, because disappointment hurts more when you're the only one feeling it. I tried to push the feeling away, focused on routines, on staying busy, on reminding myself that families aren't perfect, that everyone has off days, but denial can only last so long before reality starts knocking louder. That Thanksgiving was the first time I felt truly invisible in my own home, not unwanted outright, just unnecessary, and there's something deeply unsettling about realizing you're no longer essential in places where you once were the center. I didn't confront anyone, didn't bring it up, didn't ask for explanations, because part of me still believed that patience would be rewarded, that silence would be noticed, that kindness would eventually circle back. But as Christmas decorations began appearing in stores and people started talking about plans, I felt a knot forming in my stomach, a quiet dread mixed with hope, because I was still planning, still preparing, still believing, even after being shown I might be doing it alone. Looking back now, I see that Thanksgiving wasn't just an uncomfortable dinner, it was a warning I chose to ignore, a glimpse of what was coming if nothing changed. And as December crept closer, and the house slowly filled with decorations I set up by myself, one thought kept circling in my mind, growing louder with each passing day. If I could be treated like this when I was still giving everything, what would happen the moment I stopped? There are phone calls that feel heavy the moment you hear them ringing, even before you answer. And I knew this was one of those calls the second I saw his name light up my screen. Sigh, it was Christmas Eve, the kind of evening that's supposed to feel warm and hopeful, but instead my stomach tightened as if my body already knew what my heart wasn't ready to hear. I answered with a smile in my voice because habits are hard to break, and for a brief second I let myself believe he was calling to ask what time dinner was, or to say he'd be late, or anything normal, ha ha ha, but his voice sounded careful, distant, almost formal, and that's when the air seemed to leave the room. He spoke slowly, choosing his words like they had been practiced, and before I could interrupt or ask a single question, he said it calm and clear, as if it were a small detail instead of a blade. They wouldn't be coming for Christmas. My heart jumped, confused, because Christmas was never a question, it was a tradition, something fixed and steady in my life, and I started to speak to remind him of that, but he kept going, explaining that they were celebrating somewhere else this year, that it would be better, that it was simpler that way. Then came the part that made my hands go cold, the part that still echoes in my head when I think about it now. He said his wife wasn't comfortable with me being there, that she felt judged, that this was for the best, for the best. I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by bags of groceries, a small turkey already thawing in the sink, decorations half finished on the counter, and I felt something inside me crack so quietly I almost missed it. I didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't even raise my voice. I just nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and said I understood, because that's what I had trained myself to say over the years. He sounded relieved when I didn't argue, like he'd been bracing for a fight and was grateful he wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable tonight, and that realization hurt more than the words themselves. When the call ended, the silence in my kitchen felt unbearable, thick and heavy, and I stood there staring at the counter for a long time, replaying his tone, his pauses, the way he said, "next year," as if it were guaranteed. I looked at the list I had written earlier that day, what time to put the turkey in, what sides to prepare, small notes in my own handwriting meant for a family that wouldn't be there, and suddenly those words felt foolish, like proof of how out of sync I had become with their lives. I laughed softly, a short, empty laugh, ha ha ha, because sometimes disbelief comes out that way when crying feels too honest. I walked through the house slowly, touching ornaments I had taken out of storage, a stocking I had hung out of habit, photos on the wall that told a story very different from the one I was living now. I asked myself over and over what I had done wrong, how I had become someone to be avoided on a holiday built around family, but the more I thought about it, the clearer something else became. This wasn't about one dinner, or one comment, or one misunderstanding. It was about how easy it had become to put my feelings last because I always made room for everyone else. That night, I didn't cook, didn't decorate, didn't wrap the few gifts I had bought. I just sat at my kitchen table listening to the clock tick, letting the reality settle in layer by layer. And that's when it hit me, hard and undeniable. I was still paying for their life, still covering their comfort, still sacrificing my security while being told calmly and politely that I didn't belong at the table. My chest felt tight, my eyes burned, and for the first time in a long while, the sadness slowly turned into something else, something steadier, something that felt like clarity. I thought about every time I had chosen silence over honesty, every time I had told myself it wasn't the right moment to bring things up, and I realized there would never be a right moment if I kept waiting for permission to matter. Late that night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed asleep, I did something I hadn't planned, something I didn't even fully understand at the time, but something that felt necessary in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. My hands shook slightly, not from anger, but from the weight of the decision forming inside me, and as I stared at the screen in front of me, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Sigh, because choosing yourself after years of giving feels almost wrong at first. I didn't tell anyone, didn't announce it, didn't threaten or explain. I just made a quiet choice and closed my laptop, my heart pounding in my chest as if it already knew what was coming next. Before I went to bed, I stood in the dark hallway for a moment and whispered enough to no one in particular, and for the first time in years, that word felt powerful instead of cruel. If you're still listening to me right now, and you've ever felt that quiet moment where you realize you've been giving more than you can afford, emotionally or financially, maybe stay with me and subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the strongest turning points don't look dramatic at all, they look like silence. I went to bed that night knowing something had changed, even if I couldn't yet see the full shape of it, and as I lay there staring at the ceiling, one thought kept me awake long after sleep should have come. If they could so easily leave me out of Christmas, what would happen when they discovered I had finally stopped holding everything together? Have you ever sat down to do something small and practical, only to realize halfway through that it's about to change how you see your entire life? That's exactly what happened to me the morning after Christmas, when the house was too quiet and the holiday felt like it had never arrived at all. I woke up early not because I wanted to, but because sleep wouldn't stay with me. Sigh, my mind kept replaying that call, the calm voice, the easy dismissal, and the more I thought about it, the heavier my chest felt. I made coffee and sat at the table where I'd eaten alone the night before, staring at the empty chair across from me, and for a long moment I just breathed, slow and deep, as if I needed to steady myself before facing something I had avoided for far too long. I don't know what pushed me to do it, maybe fear, maybe instinct, but I reached for a notepad and a pen and told myself I would just write things down, Nothing dramatic, just numbers, just facts, because facts don't argue back and they don't lie. At first, I hesitated, laughing softly at myself, ha ha ha, thinking, what am I even doing? But once I started, I couldn't stop. I wrote down the rent I had been covering month after month, the exact amount, and I remember pausing, counting on my fingers like a child because the number already felt bigger than I expected. Then I added the money I had given for the wedding, telling myself at the time it was a gift, something joyful, something I was proud to contribute. And when I wrote that number down, my hand slowed, the pen pressing harder into the paper. After that came the smaller things, the ones I never thought to track because they felt insignificant on their own. Groceries, gas money, emergencies that always seemed urgent in the moment. And as each line filled the page, my stomach tightened in a way that made me feel slightly dizzy. I had to stop and breathe again, because seeing it all together felt different than remembering it in pieces. I flipped through bank statements, receipts I'd kept out of habit, transfers I barely remembered making, and slowly, painfully, a total began to form, not just in numbers, but in meaning. This wasn't generosity anymore. This was my future, my safety, my old age quietly slipping away one transaction at a time. I sat there staring at the page, my coffee cold, my hands shaking just a little, and for the first time I asked myself questions I had avoided for years. What happens if I get sick, if my car breaks down, if something goes wrong and there's no one left to help me? I was living on a fixed income, counting carefully, planning modestly, and yet I had allowed myself to become the invisible foundation holding up a life that wasn't even making space for me at Christmas. That realization didn't come with panic right away. It came with a strange, heavy calm, like standing at the edge of something you can't step back from once you see it clearly. I looked around my small kitchen, the same one I had stood in for decades, raising a child, feeding a family, and I felt foolish for how long I had told myself this was normal, that this was what love demanded. I laughed again, a bitter little sound, ha ha ha, because it finally hit me how backwards that thinking was. Love shouldn't leave you afraid of your own future, and help shouldn't cost you your dignity. I pulled out another piece of paper and wrote down my monthly income, every steady dollar I depended on, and then my expenses, the boring, unglamorous ones: mortgage, utilities, insurance, food, medicine, all the things that keep life moving quietly in the background. When I did the math, I saw it clearly. Without carrying their weight, I could breathe again, I could rebuild, I could stop living one unexpected bill away from fear. The thought scared me because it meant admitting that I had been hurting myself to protect them, and that kind of truth is hard to swallow, sigh especially when it involves your own child. I sat there for a long time, staring at those pages, listening to the clock tick, and I felt something shift inside me, something firm and steady that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, not yet, and it wasn't sadness either, it was resolve, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself but changes your posture, your breathing, the way you hold your shoulders. I realized then that continuing the way I had been wasn't kindness, it was fear dressed up as love, and fear had been making my decisions for far too long. I thought about how easily they had accepted my help, how rarely they had asked how I was doing, how quickly they had adjusted their lives around my money instead of their means, and for the first time, I stopped blaming myself for noticing it. Noticing doesn't make you cruel, it makes you honest. That morning, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary, one that made my heart race even as it calmed my mind, and I knew there would be consequences, conversations I didn't want to have, reactions I wasn't prepared for. But as I folded those papers and put them away, I felt lighter, like someone who had finally admitted the truth to themselves after years of pretending everything was fine. I stood up, washed my mug, and looked out the window at a world that hadn't changed at all, even though everything inside me had. I didn't tell anyone what I had just realized, didn't call a friend, didn't seek reassurance, because some choices need to be made quietly before they can be defended out loud. As the day went on, I moved through my routine with a new awareness, noticing how different it felt to think about my life not as something to be spent, but as something worth protecting. And as night fell again and I turned off the lights, one thought followed me into the darkness, steady and unshakable. Once you see the full cost of what you're giving, you can never go back to pretending it's free, and the moment someone feels that cost, they usually come knocking. There's a strange calm that comes right before consequences arrive, and I remember feeling it clearly that morning, like the air itself was holding its breath. I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately, making my bed, watering the plants by the window. Sigh, everything felt sharper somehow, as if my senses knew something was about to happen even though nothing had yet. I didn't feel proud of what I had done, and I didn't feel guilty either, just steady, which surprised me, because for years every decision I made came wrapped in anxiety and second guessing. That day felt different, like I had finally stepped out of a role I'd been playing for too long and was waiting to see who would notice first. I kept my phone nearby, not because I was eager to hear from anyone, but because I knew the silence wouldn't last. Ha ha ha, it never does when expectations are suddenly interrupted. Every sound in the house made my heart jump a little: the hum of the refrigerator, a car passing outside, the soft buzz of my phone lighting up with notifications that weren't from them. I tried to read, but the words blurred together, my mind drifting back to the numbers I had written down, the clarity they had brought, and the strange relief that followed. I reminded myself that I hadn't done anything cruel, anything dramatic. I had simply stopped doing something that was never truly mine to do in the first place. Still, doubt crept in, whispering familiar questions. What if this breaks everything? What if this makes things worse? What if love really does come with conditions and I've just crossed an unforgivable line? I shook my head, all because those questions sounded too much like the fear that had kept me silent for years, and I was tired of letting fear speak louder than reason. Time moved slowly, stretching each minute until finally the phone rang. I stared at the screen when I saw his name, my chest tightening, my fingers hovering just above the answer button, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out, but something told me I needed to hear this, to face it fully instead of hiding behind silence again. I answered, my voice calm in a way that almost startled me, and before I could say more than hello, the panic poured out on the other end. His words tumbled over each other, rushed and urgent, asking if I had forgotten something, if there had been a mistake, if I could please check because the rent hadn't gone through. I listened without interrupting, letting him talk himself into the truth, and when he finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I said it gently but clearly. No, I hadn't forgotten, and no, it wasn't a mistake. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had, and in that silence I could hear the shock settling in, the realization that something he depended on without thinking was suddenly gone. He asked why, his voice rising just enough to betray the fear underneath, and I explained slowly that I had been helping temporarily, that it was never meant to be permanent, that it was time for them to take responsibility for their own life. As I spoke, I felt my hands trembling slightly, but my voice stayed steady, and that alone felt like a small victory. He tried to reason with me, to remind me of how much they needed the help, how difficult things were, how this wasn't the right time, and I almost laughed, ha ha ha, because it never is the right time when someone is used to being rescued. I told him I understood that this was hard, that I didn't want them to struggle, but that I could no longer carry something that wasn't mine to hold, and saying those words out loud felt like finally exhaling after years of holding my breath. I could hear his wife in the background then, sharp and insistent, asking what I was saying, telling him to put me on speaker, and for a moment I hesitated, but then I realized this wasn't something to be hidden anymore. When her voice came through, demanding explanations, accusing me of abandoning them, something inside me hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. I told her calmly that I wasn't abandoning anyone, that I was simply stepping back from a role I had been pushed into without my consent, and that their lease, their bills, their choices were theirs to manage. The reaction was immediate, a mix of disbelief and outrage, words flying fast, sharp, cutting, meant to pull me back into the familiar position of guilt and obligation, but this time they didn't land the way they used to. I felt detached, almost observant, noticing how quickly the conversation shifted from confusion to accusation, from asking for help to demanding it, and that alone told me more than years of quiet giving ever had. When the call finally ended, my hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my ears, but beneath the adrenaline was something new, something solid, a sense that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and that was okay. I sat down, breathing deeply, letting the wave pass, and I realized that the hardest part wasn't stopping the help, it was surviving the moment when people show you how much they expected from you without asking. Outside, the day went on as usual. Neighbors passing, birds calling, the world completely unaware of the shift that had just taken place in my life. I knew this wasn't the end of it, that words spoken in panic often turn into actions once fear settles into anger. And as I stared at my quiet phone, one thought settled heavily in my mind, refusing to be ignored when support disappears. Entitlement doesn't fade quietly, it shows up face to face, and soon enough it would be standing right in front of me. You know that feeling when your heart tells you something is about to happen before your mind catches up? That's how the next morning began for me, with a strange pressure in my chest and a restlessness that wouldn't let me sit still. I kept glancing toward the front window, as if I already knew what I'd see there, even though I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. The house was quiet, too quiet, and every small sound felt louder than it should have been, until finally there it was, the sharp, unmistakable knock at the door, not gentle, not patient, but urgent, demanding, the kind of knock that doesn't ask for permission. My heart started racing as I stood up, and for a moment I considered not answering at all, ha ha ha, because once you open the door, you can't close what comes with it. But I walked toward it anyway, slow and steady, took a breath and looked through the window first, and there they were, standing on my doorstep exactly as the thought had warned me they would, faces tight with panic and anger, eyes scanning my house like it still belonged to them somehow. I didn't open the door right away, not to punish them, but to give myself a second to remember why I was here, why I had chosen this, because fear has a way of rewriting your resolve if you let it. When I finally opened it, I didn't invite them in, didn't step aside, didn't smile. I just stood there, grounded, and asked what they wanted. The shift was immediate. Confusion turned into accusation, urgency into outrage, voices rising as if volume alone could pull me back into the role they were used to. They spoke over each other, words tumbling out about stress, about pressure, about how hard things were, about how I couldn't do this to them, as if my decision was something happening to them rather than something I had chosen for myself. I listened quietly, noticing how none of it sounded like concern for me, only fear of losing what they had counted on without ever acknowledging it. When I reminded them calmly that their lease was theirs, that I had helped longer than I ever agreed to, the tone changed, sharpened, and that's when the masks really slipped. What started as pleading turned into guilt, then into blame, and finally into something uglier, words meant to cut, to shame, to scare me back into silence. I felt my hands shaking, not because I was weak, but because standing firm after years of bending takes effort, and effort can feel like trembling when you're not used to it. They talked about everything they would lose, everything that would go wrong, and not once did they ask how I was, how this had affected me, or what it had cost, and that absence spoke louder than anything else. I realized then that they didn't see me as a person standing in front of them. They saw a problem to be fixed, an obstacle in their way, and that realization hurt more than the shouting ever could. When I told them again calmly that my decision wasn't changing, that they would need to find their own solution, the disbelief on their faces turned into anger, and anger into threats, words about regret and abandonment thrown carelessly into the air. I stood there absorbing it all, sigh, feeling the old urge to apologize rise up in me, that familiar instinct to smooth things over. But this time I didn't give in, and something inside me settled, heavy but strong. Eventually, when they realized I wasn't backing down, the energy shifted again, frustration replacing fury, and they stepped back, muttering things they wanted me to hear, promises that this wasn't over. As they walked away, I closed the door slowly, leaned against it, and let my breath come back to me, my legs feeling weak even though my choice felt right. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now, like it had witnessed something important, something irreversible. And as I stood there, tears finally spilling over, not from regret but from release, I understood that this confrontation wasn't the end of the story at all. It was only the moment where everything hidden had been dragged into the light, and once that happens, nothing ever goes back to the way it was before, and the hardest truth was still waiting to be revealed. There's a moment after a storm where the air feels different, heavier but clearer, and that's how the days after that confrontation passed for me, slow and uneasy, as if the world was waiting to see what would happen next. I tried to return to my routine, told myself life would settle down now, but deep inside I knew better. People who lose control don't let go quietly, they look for another way in. My phone stayed silent at first, and that silence was almost worse than the shouting had been, because it gave my mind too much room to wander, to imagine what they were thinking, planning, telling others about me. I caught myself flinching at every notification, every unfamiliar number, every knock from outside, and I hated that they still had that power over my body even when they weren't there. Then the messages started, not all at once, but carefully spaced, almost thoughtful, apologies mixed with blame, promises tangled with warnings, and reading them felt like watching someone switch masks mid-sentence. One moment there was regret, the next there was accusation, and I realized how calculated it all was, how each word was chosen to test which version of me still existed, the giver or the woman who had finally said no. I didn't respond, not because I didn't care, but because I was beginning to understand that explanations only feed entitlement when someone believes they deserve access to you. One afternoon, as I sat at my table sorting through old papers, something caught my eye, an email I hadn't thought about in months, buried among receipts and reminders, and when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. It was written in a familiar tone, but something about it felt off, too polished, too strategic, outlining future plans, savings goals, next steps, and as I read, a cold realization settled in my chest. This wasn't desperation or poor planning, this was intention. Line by line, the message laid out expectations that had never been spoken out loud, timelines that assumed my continued support, numbers that treated my savings as part of their long-term plan, and the more I read, the more my hands began to shake, not with fear, but with clarity so sharp it almost hurt. I laughed softly, a hollow sound, ha ha ha, because suddenly everything made sense, every casual request, every delay, every promise that never quite materialized. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events, it was a design, and realizing that felt like losing something precious and gaining something powerful at the same time. I sat there for a long while, staring at the screen, letting the truth sink in, feeling a strange mix of grief and relief wash over me, grief for the trust I had given so freely, and relief that my instincts hadn't been wrong after all. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't overreacting, I wasn't imagining things, I had simply been useful for too long, and usefulness had been mistaken for obligation. As the days went on, more pieces fell into place, offhand comments that now sounded rehearsed, reactions that now felt predictable, and I began to see how carefully emotions had been used to keep me in line. The sadness was still there, but it had changed. It was quieter now, less about loss and more about acceptance. Acceptance that not everyone who benefits from your kindness wants you to grow stronger. I realized then that the anger I felt wasn't just about money or holidays, it was about being reduced to a resource instead of being valued as a person. And once that truth settles in, it's impossible to unsee it. I stopped checking my phone so often, stopped replaying conversations in my head, because clarity has a way of calming the noise, even when the situation itself is far from resolved. I knew there would be consequences to what I had discovered, uncomfortable conversations, maybe even attempts to twist the narrative, but I also knew I couldn't go back to pretending this was about love alone. That evening, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I felt something shift again, not fear, not doubt, but determination, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself but holds firm when tested. Whatever came next, I would face it with open eyes, not as someone guessing at intentions, but as someone who finally understood them. And when people realize you see them clearly, that's often when they reveal who they truly are. There's a strange peace that comes after you stop fighting the truth, and I felt it slowly settle into my days as everything finally came to the surface. Sigh not all at once, not loudly, but steadily, like the tide pulling back to reveal what had been hidden underneath all along. The weeks that followed weren't easy, but they were honest, and honesty, I learned, has a weight to it that feels heavy at first and freeing later. There were conversations that couldn't be avoided anymore, words spoken that couldn't be taken back, and moments where I had to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. But for the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking to make someone else comfortable. I watched the consequences unfold from a distance, quietly, without stepping in to fix or soften them, and that might have been the hardest part of all, resisting the urge to rescue when rescuing had been my identity for so long. Some days I felt sad, deeply sad, mourning not just what had happened, but what I had hoped would happen, the version of family I had carried in my heart even when reality kept proving otherwise. Other days I felt lighter than I had in years, laughing at small things again, ha ha ha, noticing how much energy I suddenly had when it wasn't being drained away piece by piece. I started repairing things I'd put off, both in my home and in myself, fixing what needed fixing, not because someone asked, but because I mattered too. I took better care of my health, cooked meals I enjoyed instead of stretching every dollar in fear, and reconnected with people who saw me as more than a solution to their problems. Slowly, the quiet returned to my house, but this time it didn't feel lonely, it felt safe. There were moments when doubt tried to creep back in, whispers asking if I had done the right thing, if I had gone too far, if love should have been enough to keep giving. But every time those thoughts surfaced, I reminded myself of the full picture, the patterns, the plans, the way my absence from Christmas had been accepted without hesitation. Love doesn't require you to disappear, and family doesn't mean enduring harm just to keep the peace. I learned that boundaries don't destroy relationships, they reveal which ones were real to begin with, and while that realization hurt, it also gave me clarity I didn't know I needed. Over time, communication changed, slower, more careful, stripped of assumptions, and even when things felt awkward or distant, they felt honest, and honesty, I discovered, was a better foundation than obligation ever had been. I no longer measured my worth by what I provided, but by how I felt when I looked at myself in the mirror at the end of the day, calm instead of anxious, steady instead of exhausted. Sitting alone one evening, watching the light fade through my window, I thought about everything I had learned from this experience, and the lessons felt simple but powerful. Kindness without limits invites misuse, silence teaches people how to treat you, and choosing yourself doesn't make you cruel, it makes you whole. I wished in a quiet way that I had understood these truths earlier, but I also knew it was never too late to learn them, not at any age, not after any amount of sacrifice. Life didn't become perfect after I stopped paying their rent, it became real, and real, I realized, was far better than comfortable illusions. I found joy again in small things, conversations that didn't feel transactional, days that belonged fully to me, and a sense of self-respect I hadn't felt in years. And if there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing my story, it's this: helping someone should never cost you your peace, and love should never demand your silence. If this story touched something inside you, if it felt familiar in a way that made you pause, then maybe share it with someone who needs permission to set a boundary of their own. And if you want to hear more stories like this, told honestly and without pretending everything is simple, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with me. Thank you for listening, and remember this: It's okay to choose yourself, even when the people you love don't understand it yet.